are you guys? We got another video today. We're jumping into our unit on heredity and inheritance of traits. But before we can talk about how you inherit your traits, like your eye color, your hair color, etc., we need to talk about the miraculous molecule of DNA. Let's jump into it. All right, so DNA. DNA is an acronym that actually stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Whoa, that's a long word, right? Let's break it down. The reason we have deoxyribo is because in DNA, it's actually made up of a sugar called a ribose sugar, right? Without an oxygen, so the deoxyribose, and it's a nucleic acid. So the deoxyribose stands for the sugar. If you remember back to photosynthesis, photosynthesis makes glucose, that's a sugar, right? DNA has a ribose sugar, right? So it's called deoxyribose nucleic acid. It's also nucleic acid, right? So the amazing thing about DNA is you can think of DNA as like the blueprint, right? The cookbook has all the instructions to make living things, right? All living things have DNA inside of each one of their cells. So what DNA is it contains all the infos as genes that code for your traits. So let's write that down. Contains info that carries genes that code for your traits. DNA contains info, right, or information on genes, right? Not the genes that you wear, right, but genes in DNA sense. Contains info on genes that code for your traits, right? So DNA is like the recipe book. It's a blueprint, right? It contains all the information to build a crazy phenomenal organism, whether it's a human being, a tree, a bacteria, whatever it is. The instructions to build that specific organism is carried in the DNA. Pretty crazy, right? So it contains info on genes that code for your traits, right? So you can have genes are sections of your DNA, sections of the DNA. So you can think of DNA as like a library. A gene is like one book in that library that has instructions to build one trait. So a gene, you can have a gene for something like, I can give some examples, EX, for example. You have a gene for your eye color. So maybe you have a gene for eye color. You also have a gene for hair color, right? But your traits are the specific eye color or hair color that you actually have. So maybe you have a gene for eye color, but the actual trait for your eye color is, maybe you have blue eyes. And maybe you have a gene for hair color, but your specific trait might be something like brown hair, right? So genes are sections of DNA that code for traits. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then your traits are the specific like appearance that shows up, right? So DNA carries all the information on genes that code for specific traits. So like I said, let's start with, where do we find this thing? Where do we find this DNA? Like I said, it's in every single cell in your body. If you remember, we are eukaryotic organisms. We're made of millions and trillions of cells. We're multicellular, right? But prokaryotes still have DNA, but DNA is found in every cell. So here we go. Here's a cell over here. This is my drawing of a cell. Let me write cell. Whoop, a cell. And inside of that cell, if you remember back when we talked about our cell structure, we talked about all those organelles found inside cells. The organelle inside the cell, here's the, we'll stay with black, I guess, that actually houses or contains the DNA is the nucleus. And remember, from way back when, we said the nucleus is like the brain of the cell. The reason it's the brain is because it has the DNA, This is in eukaryotic organisms. Remember, bacteria, they don't have membrane-bound organelles. Their DNA is just floating around inside that cytoplasm or cytosol inside a bacteria cell. But eukaryotic organisms like us, like plants and animals, right, that have organelles, the DNA is found inside the nucleus. And like I said, DNA is the information that has, it's a crazy, crazy molecule. It has all the information to make these unique organisms. And if it has so much information, how does it get so small and so microscopic, right? The funny thing is, one single DNA molecule is actually 6 feet long. 6 feet long. That's really, really long. Right? And if you took all of the DNA from all of the trillions of cells that make up your body, right, and put them all together and stretched them out, they go across the solar system. That'd be twice the diameter of the solar system. That's mind-blowing. That's humongous. How does that fit inside our bodies and each individual little cell that's in our bodies? The way it does that is it has to wind up in really small into a package. We call those packages chromosomes. So here are these blue X's inside the nucleus of the cell. These are called chromosomes, okay? Chromosomes. And what a chromosome is a package of DNA that's just tightly wound up. So you can think of DNA as like a spring, and if you just stretch, it can be stretched out or it can be packaged really tight. So a chromosome is a package of DNA that is tightly wound, right? So, like I said, DNA carries all this crazy information. It has to get really, really small because it has so much it has to get small to fit inside every single cell, and even smaller than that has to fit inside the nucleus, so it winds up in these things called chromosomes. Human beings have 46 chromosomes. They actually come in pairs, so that's why it's an X. You got one line and the other line. Those are pairs of chromosomes coming together. So you have 46 in humans, 23 pairs. All right, but it's still not small enough, right? It's so much information, it's still not small enough to fit inside a chromosome. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna zoom in. We're gonna zoom in right to one of these chromosomes and look at what DNA looks like a little bit closer. So we're gonna zoom in, here's my arrow. We're zooming, zoom in, right? So we're zooming into a chromosome. Here's one chromosome, let's zoom in, let's take a look at this part of the chromosome right here, and this is what we're gonna start to see. We're gonna start to see what the DNA actually starts to look like, right? And even though it's packaged into a chromosome, it has to get even smaller. So what they found out is that DNA is actually like a twisted ladder. It twists up like a ladder into a small, small shape. And that special shape that it takes is called a double helix, right? Double for two, and helix means like twisted up. So DNA, right? This is a DNA molecule. DNA is wound into a double helix shape. So it's the shape that DNA is wound into, right? Double helix, like a twisted ladder, right? You twist up that ladder and get smaller and smaller and smaller to conserve space. All right, so found in every single one of our cells, more specifically in the nucleus of our cells, remember the brain of the cells, packaged this chromosome and wound up even tighter into a double helix. All right, so I'll talk about these colors in a minute, but first let's talk about what, we're gonna zoom in again, so let's zoom in down here, we're zooming in, zooming in, zoom in again, right? We zoomed into a chromosome, looked at the double helix shape, now we're gonna zoom in to one part of a DNA molecule. So let's zoom in right here. Zoom in into this part of a DNA molecule. And we're gonna look at the little building blocks of DNA. So DNA is double-stranded, that means two strands. You notice here's one strand, here's a second strand, right? And to make each one of these strands, you need something called, or things called nucleotides. And you can think of a nucleotide as like a Lego block. As you start adding Lego blocks, you start to build one side or one strand of a DNA molecule. So let's talk about what makes up that Lego block, right? So a nucleotide is made of three things. It's made of a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogenous base, or a base, right? So here's my drawing down here. Here's a nucleotide. So what we got here, this is our phosphate. This is our sugar. Remember, do you remember what sugar that was? Yeah, that's right. It's a ribose sugar, right? It's a ribose sugar. Remember, deoxyribose nucleic acid. So here's our ribose sugar, and it's attached to our nitrogenous base, which we find on the inside that make up the rungs of the ladder, like these colors, which we'll talk about in a minute, right? So on the backbone of DNA is called, the sugar, phosphate, backbone, right? Sugar phosphate backbone, because one strand of a DNA molecule is made up of alternating sugar and phosphate. So we got a phosphate, then a sugar, then we're gonna have another phosphate, a sugar, phosphate, sugar as we go along the outside. And on the inside, these rungs, like I mentioned, these are our bases. These are our nitrogenous bases. We call them nitrogenous because they have a lot of the atom nitrogen that make them up, right? And there are 4 nitrogenous bases in DNA, only 4, which is miraculous because these bases are really important, are the instructions more or less, right, to build the organism. But there's only 4. But it depends on how those 4 line up inside the DNA molecule that codes for different genes, that codes for different traits, right? Codes for different traits. So it's really the order, the sequence of these bases that determine what traits you have. But there's only really 4 ingredients. So let's talk about them. The 4 bases are Adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. I said that quick, but the way you can remember it is GCAT. G for guanine, C for cytosine, A for adenine, and T for thymine. So I wrote those down here, right? Guanine, and when we abbreviate this in DNA, we just write the G for guanine. And I'm going to make guanine today green, because G starts with, or green starts with guanine, right? So it makes sense. Green, guanine, easy, all right? And then the second base is cytosine. We're going to make cytosine blue today. Whoop, whoop. A blue cytosine. Then we have adenine, or A for adenine. That's going to be red today. Bloop, 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 bloop. And finally, because I ran out of colors, last color we're going to use is black for thymine, or T. Right? Those are the 4 bases, and how they pair up determines what traits you're going to have. All right? Remember, these are the instructions. How they pair up determine your traits. So let's recap real quick before we move on. So inside of each of your cells, you find the DNA, but more specifically, inside the nucleus, packaged as a chromosome, wound up into a double helix, made up of nucleotides, like the Lego blocks, right, that are made up of phosphate sugar. That's the outside, that's the backbone. And on the inside, these colors, these are the rungs, these are the bases. So if you notice, there's 4 bases: guanine, cytosine, adenine, and thymine. If you notice, there's a pattern that emerges here. So if you're looking at this colors here, what do you notice? Green. What's on this side? Blue. Interesting. Huh. Here's green. What's on this side? Blue again. Does green ever pair up with anything other than blue? No. Weird. What do we see here? Red pairs with black. Black pairs with red. Green with blue. Whoa, that's weird. So what we notice is, here's green. Remember, that's guanine. Guanine always pairs with cytosine. So G and C go together in DNA. G and C pair together, and that means adenine, A, and thymine always pair together. Okay? Pair together, they always match up. That's called being complementary. These are complementary bases, right? If you ever said someone was talking about an outfit or something, and they said, oh my gosh, those shoes are so complementary with that outfit. That means they like go together, they pair up really nice. That's the same thing. G, guanine, is complementary to C. It means they always go together. All right, so going back here, so it's our nucleotide. Now, we've been zooming in a lot. So what we're going to do here, we're zoomed in real close to a nucleotide. We're going to zoom out this time. So here we go. We're zooming out. Whoop. This time, zoom out. And we're back to this stage. We're looking at a DNA molecule this time. But remember, this isn't a double helix shape. Now we're looking at the DNA, but it's unzipped. We unzipped it, right? Now we're looking at an unzipped double helix of DNA. So if you notice, we took this and we twisted it up. We turned it into a double helix, but right now we untwisted it. Now we can see here's one side of DNA, here's one strand, here's the other strand of DNA, right? So here's one side, here's the other side. We unzipped it. We can see the 2 complementary strands. So how we mentioned that G and C are complementary and A and T are complementary. Double helix of DNA is double, so it means 2 strands, and each strand is complementary. It means they go together as well. So these are called complementary strands. All right, complementary strands. And let's look at this. This should look a little familiar, because let's break it down into the parts. Remember, we said DNA is made up of nucleotides, which are those Lego blocks. So you notice, here's one nucleotide. We've got a phosphate, we've got our sugar, and we've got our base on the inside. So these 3 things together make one nucleotide. And look, here's another Lego block. We got a phosphate, a sugar, and a base. Here's another nucleotide. Now we stack another one. Phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base. That makes one strand of DNA. Now on this side, phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base, phosphate, sugar, base. We're stacking those nucleotides, those Lego blocks, to make up each strand of DNA. All right? So I'm going to kind of copy this one. So if we have G up here, right, if I wrote G, this is our guanine base. What is going to be complementary to G? G always pairs with, yeah, that's right, cytosine, right? So I'm going to write C for cytosine. Remember, that's blue, cytosine. And then we had on the left side, we had adenine. So here's A. And A, adenine, is complementary to, that's right, thymine, which we said was black, so T. A and T pair together, right? So let's keep going. So what's going to go next? You're right, guanine. After guanine, we had black, which was thymine. And then after thymine, we had guanine again. Here's another guanine. Oop. Guanine, another guanine. All right, I'll give you a sec. See if you can figure out those complementary bases. So if we have guanine on one side, what's going to be complementary? Yeah, cytosine. Nice. Cytosine. And then we're going to have adenine with thymine. These are complementary. And finally, we're going to have G and C. So the reason I wrote GCAT over here, GCAT, is because I organized them based on who's complementary to each other. G is complementary with C. A is complementary to T, right? Adenine and thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And remember, guys, last thing I want to mention is we talked about genes, right? You can think of DNA, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, DNA is like this huge library of all this information to make these crazy organisms. But one book in that library, one book, if we pick up one book from the shelf, we wanted to just make one trait, like your eye color or your hair color, we look at one gene. So a gene is a section of DNA that codes for a specific trait. So a gene is a section of DNA that codes for a trait, right? Codes for a trait. So maybe if we're looking at this DNA molecule, maybe just a couple of these bases, this section, so maybe we're just talking about this section from here to here, maybe that section, the AGT, codes for, I don't know, hair color, right? And if you have these specific bases lined up in this order, maybe this is, maybe if you have AGT, maybe that's blue eyes. Or sorry, if we're doing hair color, maybe that's brown hair, right? But what if we change one of these bases? What if there's a mistake? We're going to talk about it a lot in a couple videos coming up, but that's called a mutation. We start changing these base pairs around, right? Instead of AGT, we change this A to another G. Maybe now GGT. Maybe that changes your hair color. Maybe you were supposed to be born brown hair, but if you change this, now you're going to be born with blonde hair. What? Pretty crazy. Yeah, so we start messing around with these instructions, the DNA, it's going to change the organism, right? Whether you're a plant, a bacteria, a human, a dog, a lion, whatever, all living things have DNA that code for their traits. So pretty phenomenal. Hope this was helpful. And of course, always guys, remember, work hard, get smart, and I'll see you next time.